Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I have a confession to make right off the bat. I had never seen a Greg Araki movie before last Thursday. I know, I can't say much more than this is one of my more shameful blind spots as a self-appointed film critic. Before the release of his latest film this past weekend, the dark erotic comedy I Want Your Sex, I had been totally unfamiliar with Greg Araki's work, his often being cited as a quintessential voice of so-called new queer cinema, or the queer new wave, a branch of the independent film explosion of the late 80s through the 90s that saw the rising accessibility and positive appraisal of films explicitly dealing with queer identities, sex, and queer culture. B. Ruby Rich, the film critic who coined the term, she would have pointed to Araki as exemplary of this rising tide of new queer cinema alongside such filmmakers as Todd Haynes and Derek Jarman. Probably best known still for his black comedy thriller The Doom Generation from 1995, which pretty much established Araki's cult fandom through a consistent career in both film and television. I'm happy to say that, as someone who had no experience with Araki's earlier work, his particular stylistic signatures, his sense of humor, I still got a lot out of I Want Your Sex. This stars Cooper Hoffman as Elliot, a drifting 20-something who's complacently going through the motions of an emotionally and sexually detached relationship with his girlfriend Minerva, played by Charlie XCX. She's a medical student who is both physically and professionally out of his league, and while extolling her virtues as a reliable and consistent entity, I guess, in his life, Elliot seems to literally just be guilelessly keeping up pretenses with this relationship because he knows she's out of his league to a degree that he seems like satisfied with being able to just fantasize her actually being sexually available to him. There's a scene where he's gracelessly trying to ask her to while she's studying, and while she's talking, we see in his mind's eye just imagining Minerva ripping open her shirt and these huge floppy anime boobs, and I mean literally animated boobs that are composited over Charlie's chest, begging him to her, a formulaic but well-timed absurd touch to clue us in that whatever sexual frustrations Elliot has don't really have much to do with realistic expectations about what constitutes actual sexual exploration and not just trying to recreate stuff that you see in pornography. Another green flag for old Elliot, he's also basically lived unemployed and parasitically off of his childhood friend Apple, Chase Sui Wonders, since they both graduated college, but that all changes when Elliot, whose only other career plan was podcasting, makes a spur-of-the-moment decision to apply for a highly competitive professional assistant internship with an LA-based conceptual artist named Erica Tracy, renowned for her sexually explicit and provocative mixed media and installation pieces, all filtered through a personal brand evincing her shameless libertinism. She's played by Olivia Wilde. Undergirding Araki and co-screenwriter Carly Sortino's character work here is always the pretty obvious extent to which sex completely consumes Elliot's interior life, and it's literally the only thing we ever see him hyper-fixating upon, and so it's not far from either our or his roommate Apple's mind that he might literally be just trying to get a job with this woman because he's turned on by her, but in a twist of fate, not only does Elliot land the position over a room of clearly more qualified, not cis male or white or straight candidates, but within a matter of weeks, he's also effortlessly submitting to a BDSM kink relationship with his boss, with whom he becomes increasingly delusionally infatuated with because of how he comes to see his submission towards her as finally unlocking the kind of exciting, boundary-pushing sexual journey he's always dreamed of having. Much to the chagrin of Apple, who is apparently something of an incel, or a femcel, I guess would be the word for it, literally her dumbest, blandest, most incompetent best friend who is only alive and not living with his parents and able to have these opportunities because of her. While they're playing mini golf one night, she complains that the exciting sex stuff is always happening to him. Apparently, none of this is shown, but it's actually a really fine point of both dramatic and comedic irony that Araki works into his screenplay here. Because Elliot is kind of just such an immediately identifiable stereotype of a drifting, prospectless, and ultimately overprivileged white guy that we are almost primed to take for granted that when he talks about his sexual frustration, that he means that he just hasn't had a very exciting sex life because he honestly just doesn't have a very mature set of values about what he wants from his sexual partners. But it's actually really important that through Apple as the actual incel in their friendship, the one who really is being prevented from living her fullest life because she has responsibilities he doesn't, we get a sense of the duality of Elliot as an example of that stereotype. The impression Apple leaves us with is that Elliot has, in fact, simply by unapologetically being himself, no matter how mediocre to look at, or charmless in affect, or lacking in self-awareness, he's actually the one who's stumbling ass backwards into some pretty exciting sexual experiences, and of course, his real problem is that he just doesn't appreciate them. He wants a more successful, more independent, more mature, and incredibly attractive woman to boss him around and give him structure in his life. He could already have that with his girlfriend, but it's not enough because she won't play into the sexual gratification part. Erica will gladly take advantage of Elliot, and while I can probably already hear some viewers out there calling this a gender swap of the 2002 erotic rom-com Secretary, I assure you that while postmodern intertextuality abounds all over the place as much as I might have expected from a veteran filmmaker of the music video 90s, to my mind what Araki seems to be playing to rather explicitly here goes back way further to The Graduate. Comedy is pretty relative to the extent that I can really only say that I Want Your Sex tickled enough of my sense of humor to overlook the fact that even as Araki is inevitably able to deliver a much more authentic sense of genuine sympathy with the dimensions and possibilities of sex than most gross-out sex comedies do, it's still basically and non-apologetically a kind of formulaic, gross-out sex comedy, and I think Araki is able to deliver that to an acceptable degree. But I also think I Want Your Sex kind of becomes exceptional and fascinating, especially for a time in which we are seeing a kind of return to more erotic or at least sexually explicit films marketed to an adult audience. It wasn't a packed audience or anything when I went to see it, but we had a healthy turnout while everybody else was going to see Spider-Man 9. Then again, I'm probably underestimating the power of Araki's name to herd cult film fans in. But for those of you about as in the know about new Hollywood of the late 60s through the 70s as they are new queer cinema of the late 80s through the 90s, The Graduate is one of those movies that you still see people talking about how it's one of the more overrated classics of the new Hollywood era, even though it, could not be more relevant now than the time in which it was made. The Graduate is a movie that stars Dustin Hoffman as Ben, a drifting, sheltered, white college graduate from an affluent background who, just because of how pathetic and malleable he is, ends up stumbling face forward into an exciting affair with a married older neighbor from his suburb named Mrs. Robinson, played by Anne Bancroft. Much like Elliot, Ben ends up finding that this sudden eruption into sexual adventure, pushing the boundaries of current taboos, unlocks his untapped confidence and potential, which basically means it turns him into a shallowly confident douchebag. You know, give a loser just a whiff of pussy and suddenly he thinks he's a romantic, Byronic anti-hero. It is very important to The Graduate that Ben's arc as a character is very predictable given his privilege and sheltering, but not sympathetic, besides of course getting a little too big for his britches, becoming increasingly demanding of Mrs. Robinson. He can't even stop himself from falling for her daughter Elaine, played by Catherine Ross, who he ends up becoming obsessed with to the point of literally literally stalking her all the way out to Berkeley, where she's still studying. The Graduate isn't the only text that Araki is drawing upon with his intertextual references, whether it's the cheeky nod to Adrian Lynn's 9.5 Weeks, the structure and some of the themes of Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, or the rather obvious stunt casting of Cooper Hoffman himself, given that his debut role in Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza also saw him portraying a naive, self-important, drifting teenage boy who was in a relationship with a woman in her 20s. But The Graduate is the most important conversation piece for appreciating I Want Your Sex, I think, because by channeling the themes of that film, especially identifying with that anti-heroic portrayal of a drifting but overprivileged white 20-something who becomes myopically hyper-fixated on sex and romance as a means of gratification and validation for their own lack of self-worth or self-cultivation, but then interpreting that base narrative, that trope, through a more multifaceted queer lens that isn't just updated but more granularly informed by a non-judgmental presentation of queerness and explicit kink. What Araki is able to achieve here is not just, for your mileage, a genuinely funny and interestingly textured sex comedy, but a kind of layered satire of so much of the hyperfixation in our present mainstream culture with the so-called male loneliness epidemic as a seemingly novel problem. It's really interesting and really important that Araki and Sortino make the frustrated incel character a queer woman. It's also really interesting and really important that they also imagine a scenario in which a drifting white 20-something might espouse all the same sexual frustrations of a stereotypical nice guy incel, except that he is the one who simply doesn't appreciate that, no, you've actually had a lot of exciting sexual experiences and romantic opportunities that most people would never have in their entire lives. And if anything, the problem is that once you even get the gratification and validation you're craving, you immediately take it for granted. You start manically assuming more self-importance, whether Elliot has sex or not, whether he actualizes these great fantasies he has doesn't matter, because that underlying sense of entitlement remains unmodified. He gets what he's always wanted just to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt he didn't even deserve to have those opportunities to begin with. He just filed them away and moved on to the next hyperfixation. It doesn't actually mean as much to him as he thinks it does. There are points at which I Want Your Sex dares to stop being just a dark comedy and instead broach the territory of genuinely sad and tragic complications to the narrative, where it was really reminiscent for me of John Cameron Mitchell's Short Bus, which I think does a similarly good job of, through its own narrative of characters finding themselves unlocked by a sudden explosion of sexual opportunity, but then really dealing with that uncomfortable question about when sexual liberation stops being about the liberation of people and starts becoming a vector for individuals to use the guise of sexual liberation as a way of just gratifying and validating themselves because of their own grievances and lacks in their lives, no matter how much we can come to empathize with and understand how they got to that place. As an update of The Graduate, I Want Your Sex brings so much of the thematic relevancy of that classic new Hollywood film as one of these often cited countercultural or counterculture-informed popular movies that was just cracking the shell on an explosion of sexual liberation, of free love, of non-monogamy, but where at the center of it is a guileless, drifting white 20-something from an affluent background who comes to stand in as an archetype of that generation of affluent white boys to men, atomized, socially illiterate, and lacking in confidence, direction, and, of course, being sexually frustrated as the baseline point of popular obsession, whether or not young boys and men are f***ing enough. Araki and Sortino kind of channel and satirize that obsession through the queer veiling of the now itself kind of outdated in its own way new queer cinema, their own counterculture or counterculture informed moment. And what that satire of that obsession brings into such sharp clarity is that obsession with male loneliness, with male sexual frustration, especially white, affluent male loneliness and frustration. This isn't a novel phenomenon. What we're seeing is new waves of a recurring reactionary fixation of the same supposedly novel condition of directionlessness and sexual frustration and loneliness of boys and men, almost as if to say, if we've been making movies about this since 1966, how new is the male loneliness epidemic really? I believe, for instance, that due to declining material prospects, and especially with Zoomers being quite slammed by COVID-19 isolation during their most formative educational years leading into supposed adulthood, I believe that people in general are having less sex. But maybe the only thing that has really changed at a fundamental level when it comes to the supposed crisis of male loneliness is that now we have the internet to tell us about it. We now have the internet to shout in our faces that, yeah, a lot of guys are not out here f***ing like that. In fact, I'm not going to say the majority, but maybe the plurality of boys and men go through pretty significantly long periods of time where sexual frustration is just foundational to your experience. The spigot of neuroses has just been turned all the way open by social media, so now, for perhaps the first time in history, we are just receiving the most basic kind of snapshot into how many boys and men just don't get laid like that and never will outside of the context of them actually learning to appreciate one or two individual women they see monogamously over the course of their lifetime. And that, therefore, when we talk about the supposed male loneliness epidemic, what we are actually doing is vainly grasping for the same old solution that will sound new to us for the same old but decidedly not new problem of boys and men just not hitting it like that, and our culture just not being real and honest with them that you probably never will hit like that. Now, of course, Elliot does hit like that, and he's still a fucking incel. He doesn't appreciate it because he's living in a fucking fantasy world. He's probably the only guy as unremarkable that he knows who hits the way he does, and it goes in one ear and out the other for him. The whole point of why the male loneliness epidemic is so absurd as a concept is that affluent white 20-somethings, even when more of them just straight up aren't fucking like that, are still, no matter how dime a dozen they are, more privileged in terms of access to the kind of baseline sexual satisfaction that, more to the brilliant satiric point of I Want Your Sex and how it echoes The Graduate, if you are even just a woman with any kind of sexual desires that transgress any kind of heteronormative masculine-feminine norms, you quite literally might have to cut off part of your humanity to have it. Like, you might literally need to be a calculating sociopath. You need to be really as an incredibly beautiful and accomplished woman to have half the shot of some pasty, unemployed white guy. I Want Your Sex is both a solid sex comedy on its own baseline terms, but because of its layers of intertextuality and its satirical framework, it becomes exceptional, bringing into timely, rare clarity that we do not currently have a unique male loneliness epidemic, whereas we have always had an epidemic of male entitlement, which we kind of need to get better at not hand-holding with unrealistic, escapist fantasies that every run-of-the-mill dude should have the opportunity to more than one woman at the same time just because of how nice they are and get better at making fun of that expectation. I'm giving I Want Your Sex a fair 3.5 out of 5. In a year as slow as mine has been going with movies, it might end up being one of my favorites. Anyway, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right, what did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.